welcome. I'm Carolyn Grimminger with the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Today, our speaker is Luke Metzger. He is the founding director of Environment Texas, a statewide citizen-funded advocacy group for clean air, clean water, and open spaces. Capital Inside named him one of the top lobbyists for causes, and he has received the President's Award for the Texas Recreation and Park Society for his work to protect Texas parks. He will discuss the growing environmental dangers in Texas, the recent actions of the Texas legislature, and what the future looks like. Let's welcome Mr. Metzger.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you all for inviting me to be here. I wanted to talk a little bit about Environment Texas, the work that we do, and then spend the bulk of my time talking about what happened to the environment in this past legislative session here in Texas. So at Environment Texas, we think that there's something special about Texas, whether it's the hill country or Big Bend or sea turtles, baby sea turtles climbing into the Gulf of Mexico on the beaches of South Padre. We have a beautiful state here, and unfortunately, there are too many threats to it, to our air and to our water and to our land, and too often, whether it's powerful industries or their allies in the legislature and government, and the incredible amount of money they spend on lobbyists and campaign contributions often stack the deck against the environment. And so that's where Environment Texas and a lot of the allied organizations we work with come in to be a voice for our air and for our water and for our environment to make sure that we can win real results to protect the things that we care about and the values that we all share. And that's a tough job these days, I think increasingly so. But we've had some significant victories that we're very proud of and want to tell you a little bit about. Just about a month or two ago now, we won our lawsuit against ExxonMobil. We had sued the company for violating the Clean Air Act at its Baytown refinery and chemical plant outside of Houston. And we found, according to the records that the company filed itself with the state of Texas, they had violated the Clean Air Act more than 16,000 times and put out more than 10 million pounds of pollution illegally. And we filed suit in 2010, and finally, just a month ago, the judge ruled in our favor, ordering Exxon to pay an almost $20 million penalty for those violations. And yeah. And we think that that's actually the largest penalty from a citizen environmental lawsuit in U.S. history, by perhaps more than double. So it's a pretty big victory, and Exxon is appealing it already, so may go all the way up to the Supreme Court. We don't know. That would be pretty cool, though. But definitely, I think, at least holds this company accountable and sends a message to other companies that violate the law that they're at risk of facing these kinds of consequences, and hopefully they'll start to change their behavior. So that's one victory. We also just had a victory on Thursday. We've been working to protect our waterways like Lady Bird Lake and others from urban runoff pollution. And we know that as we grow as a state and pave more of our open spaces, when it rains, there's no place for the rain to go but to pick up a lot of the pollution, the animal waste, and the pesticides and fertilizers rush along that pavement into our waterways. And so as a result, there's 10 creeks here in Austin that don't meet basic state standards for water quality. Also, Lady Bird Lake is impaired in part because of that pollution. And so one solution to that is to mimic nature through what's called green stormwater infrastructure. That's things like green roofs and porous pavement and rainwater harvesting, things that absorb the rain or capture the rain and use it before it picks up the pollution and rushes into our creeks. Just on Thursday, the Austin City Council, thanks to the leadership of Council Member Ann Kitchen, passed an ordinance unanimously to direct the city manager to develop a green infrastructure plan and to make sure to include these kinds of elements in the upcoming, or the Code Next process, the update to our land development code, so that as we're developing and growing, we're making sure to adopt these kind of elements to mitigate the water quality impacts and flooding impacts and other things that come with development. So we're pretty proud about that as well. Wanted, as I said, mention the Texas legislature, and I've been lobbying and a registered lobbyist in the Texas legislature since 2003. This is one of the worst, unfortunately, for the environment. And we kind of going into each session, we recognize that it's a challenging and political environment. The environment itself is not a top priority necessarily, and in fact, we have big business, oil companies, and others who spend millions of dollars in campaign contributions, wining and dining lawmakers, and other steps that really make it hard for us to advocate for our agenda. So going into this session, we develop our legislative agenda and around air quality, water quality, parks, protecting bees and other issues, but we also recognized that we probably didn't have a very strong chance of having a very proactive agenda, and so we spent a lot of our time just looking at defense, working to stop bad things from happening, and that it turned out to be the case that our proactive agenda didn't get very far, and we had to spend the bulk of our energy fighting off bad things, and to lesser or greater success, unfortunately. Yeah. So let me go through just the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Texas legislative session. There were a couple good things, mostly bad and ugly, unfortunately. So let's take a moment to appreciate the good. So one good thing is that the Texas legislature reauthorized the Texas Emissions Reduction Program, or TERP. It's a program that all Texans pay fees into to provide a fund that will give grants out to everybody from mostly businesses to update their dirty diesel equipment. So the diesel trucks or diesel off-road equipment, even kind of maritime equipment in our ports. And about 2 years ago, the legislature had also created a new program to provide rebates for electric vehicles. And they provided about $5 million in rebates, and it was a very successful program, and unfortunately that program went away in the 2015 legislative session. Then this current session, a coalition of organizations led by a group called Plug-in Texas, which includes everybody from environmental groups like Environment Texas, Environmental Defense Fund, to some of the big electric power companies like Illuminant and TXU, who like electric cars because it means they can sell more electricity, right? As well as some of the automobile manufacturers who are producing some of these electric vehicles like GM and Ford and others. And so that coalition came together to ask the legislature to reinstate this rebate program. And we think that's critical, of course, because transportation is the largest source of global warming pollution in the United States. It just overtook power plants a couple years ago. And we know that if we're going to stave off the worst impacts of climate change, as well as the problems of local air pollution, we need to get off of fossil fuel entirely, and electric cars provide that great promise. And a rebate program really helps bring down the cost of electric vehicles. So the good news is the legislature did reauthorize that program, and basically it'll provide a $2,500 rebate to about 2,000 Texans. And that $2,500 rebate combined with a $7,500 tax credit really does help bring down the cost of electric vehicles and make it a lot more affordable for regular folks and not just the super wealthy. So that was a success. There is a wrinkle, unfortunately, in that program. The legislature authorized it, but the budget didn't specifically appropriate the funds, so there's still a little bit of work to be done to make sure TCEQ provides the funds. They do have some flexibility within that Texas Emission Reduction Program to move money from one pot to another, so we're optimistic that they'll do that, and this program will be up and running again in a few months. Another modest bill that passed was a bill to require water utilities to have somebody on staff to be in charge of water conservation. And that's, perhaps the less big a deal for a city like Austin, which has a very large, water conservation program and a lot of folks on staff doing that. But for smaller utilities, they, in some cases, don't have anybody who's point on thinking about water conservation. And so the legislature passed a bill to say that if you apply for state funds, which most of them do, you have to have somebody that is in charge of water conservation. It might not be their full-time job. They might wear a few different hats, but it does have somebody that really has to think about these things day in, day out. And so we think that's an important step, very modest, but progress still. So now the bad. So first, folks remember the tragedy in Flint, Michigan related to lead in drinking water, and where an entire community was poisoned with lead. And unfortunately, those problems, while extreme in Flint, are not unique to Flint. And in fact, we're finding lead throughout Texas, including in our schools. And lead, of course, is a potent neurotoxin and can cause serious problems, health problems, even at low levels to children, including behavior and learning and other basic things. They did a study in Wisconsin of about 4,000 fourth graders, and they found that children with even low levels of lead in their blood scored significantly worse on reading and writing tests than children who didn't have lead in their blood. So this is a significant problem. We did a survey after Flint happened. Some school districts started to do testing, and we've collected the results of several of the school districts around the state, and we found that 65% of schools that had done testing had found lead in their water, above levels that pediatricians recommend of 1 part per billion. And so that's clearly a problem. The first most significant school district was Fort Worth. They identified, I think, more than 60 water fountains that had unsafe levels of lead in them. And they did the right thing. They did the testing, they publicized the results to parents, and then they, most importantly, remediated, pulled those water fountains out of service and got in safer forms of, or newer safe forms of water fountains. And some school districts around the state have done less. So for example, here in Austin, the AISDs only tested about half the schools. Half the schools they tested, they only found 2 with lead, so that's good. However, the other half we just don't know, and the other half include dozens of schools that were built before 1986, where when lead was banned from pipes. So we still have some work to do here in Austin as well. So we had got 2 legislators to introduce bills to require schools to get the lead out. Representative Jessica Farrar of Houston and Senator Sylvia Garcia of Houston both had bills to, again, one, require testing, and then if lead was found, to actually remediate and remove the lead pipes. And we got hearings for both of those bills, we got hearings for one of those bills, and unfortunately, the hearing was not, did not go that great. The TCEQ, basically, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the staffer who testified before the committee was asked, well, is there a problem? Do we have a problem here in Texas with lead? And she said no, despite 65% of school districts reporting they found lead in their water. And so we had that problem. Then we had the chairman of the committee, Charles Perry of Lubbock, who said, well, is lead really that big a deal? We all grew up drinking it, and we turned out okay. Yeah, horrible. So that was very discouraging, and unfortunately then the legislature took no action to address lead in our drinking water. And so moving forward, we're again going to turn our attention back to the school districts, because that's where we have an opportunity. And for example, Austin AISD is about to put a big bond on the before voters in November. We think they should set aside some funds to deal with lead remediation. Another bill, this is a building with lots of green roofs, which again, green infrastructure, absorb the rain, help prevent the runoff. There's a bill, again, by Jessica Farrar to direct the state of Texas to study green stormwater infrastructure. It's just a simple study bill. And the bill, and it was carried in the Senate by Senator Rodriguez of El Paso. The bill passed the Senate by a vote of 27-4. And then, unfortunately, in the House of Representatives, the Texas Conservative Coalition came out against the bill, arguing that by studying green stormwater infrastructure, the state was putting its thumb on the scale of one technique to address stormwater. Which of course, if anything, the state's been putting the thumb on gray infrastructure for decades, and this is really opening up the marketplace and providing alternatives and studying alternatives. We think that it's possible that they decided to come out against Jessica Farrar's bill because of some other actions she had taken related to women's health and other issues, and they wanted to punish her. We're not sure if that's actually what happened, but unfortunately then the House voted that bill down, a bill to study green stormwater infrastructure. And it shouldn't be that controversial, but so unfortunately that bill died. However, one bright spot is I spoke with the chairman of the Texas Water Development Board, and he offered to perhaps have the agency go ahead and study it voluntarily. So we may be able to continue that even without legislative action. So then there was a bill by Senator Rodriguez to address illegal dumping of tires. Tires, of course, when disposed of improperly, can pose significant problems to public health. For example, by collecting water serving as breeding grounds for mosquitoes. And so a lot of public health officials around Texas were asking the state to take some more action to help curb the rise in mosquito-borne diseases like West Nile or Zika and other things. And so Senator Rodriguez had a bill to basically assess a fine and create some regulations to better handle the disposal of tires. The bill passed the legislature, had wide support from community groups, public health officials all around the state, only to be vetoed by Governor Abbott. And that came out of nowhere. He had not signaled any problems with the bill prior to the veto, and his argument was that, well, Texans might be confused, they wouldn't know what the law was, which I think doesn't give Texans a lot of credit. I think if you need to find something out, what do? You Google it, right? So how do I dispose of tires in Texas? The legislature this session also was in charge of reauthorizing the Railroad Commission of Texas, which, as I'm sure you probably know, does not regulate trains, but is in charge of oil and gas and other energy here in the state of Texas. Every agency in Texas periodically has to go through what's called sunset review, where they are basically audited by professional staff, and the staff and then an elected body to make recommendations to the legislature about whether we should continue to have the agency, and if so, whether any changes should be made to make them more effective. The staff of the Sunset Commission found that the Railroad Commission had a poor track record of enforcement, and that their enforcement and penalty policy did not actually deter violations, which of course is a critical goal of enforcement, so that you hold someone accountable and then you let other people know, oh, that's why I should follow the law, because there'll be consequences. And so the staff of the agency made recommendations to boost enforcement at the Railroad Commission. They also found that the bonding requirements for fracking and oil and gas were inadequate. So basically, when you want to drill here in Texas, you have to put up a bond so that in case you go bankrupt and go belly up, there's some money to clean up the waste once there's no one around to handle it. What the Sunset Commission staff found was that on average, oil and gas companies were only paying about 17% of the cost of cleanup. So that meant the other 83% of cleanup was borne by taxpayers to pay to clean up the mess of oil companies that abandoned these wells. And so the the Sunset Commission staff made a very modest recommendation to change some of the policies that effectively would have boosted the amount oil companies had to post as bond to equal 21% of the cost of cleanup. So going up from 17 to 21. So then that was what the staff recommended. The actual Sunset Commission, which is made up of 8 legislators and 2 public officials appointed by Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. The Sunset Commission thought that was too much after the Texas Oil and Gas Association lobbied against it and said, oh, price of oil is already so low, this is going to cause all sorts of problems. So that was too much, and so the Sunset Commission rejected those 2 important recommendations around enforcement and better bonding. So as a result, the legislature passed a bill to reauthorize the Railroad Commission, but they rejected any efforts to actually make it any better and hold oil and gas companies accountable, make sure that they're cleaning up their mess and better protecting the public. So now the ugly. So it gets worse, if you can imagine that. So right now in Texas, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, they did a study that found that about 12,000 Texans die prematurely each year because of air pollution. And that's from a variety of air pollution sources, including transportation and manufacturing facilities. So air pollution is clearly a serious problem, and we are, as I've mentioned, enforcement's been pretty weak, but we also at the same time are growing and having even more facilities permitted in the state of Texas. The current law in terms of permitting said that if a company wanted to build a polluting facility near your house or near your community, that you would have 2 opportunities to raise concerns and formally be part of the process for state regulators to consider community concerns. And the legislature passed a bill to cut that in half, to only give you 1 opportunity now. And that was important because basically when you would when a company applies for a permit under previous law, you would get an opportunity when they first applied to comment, and then they go through a whole process of making changes and amendments to the permit, and you would have a chance a second time based on the actual permit that's going to go forward to make comments. So now they've cut that in half, and you only have 1 chance. Perhaps a modest step backwards. We also know that bees are, of course, critical pollinators of our food supply. 1 out of every 3 forkfuls of food was pollinated by a bee. However, we're seeing increasing declines in bee populations, and scientists point to a variety of causes, including climate change, mites, habitat loss, but also a class of bee-killing pesticides called neonicotinoids, or neonics. And 80% of the neonics are actually applied to seeds, and that makes them systemic, so the pesticide kind of goes throughout the plant. And at the same time, we know that big agribusiness, including Monsanto and Syngenta and Dow, are not only treating these seeds with pesticides, but they're also genetically modifying the seeds. And in concern that cities might start to regulate these seeds to either protect bees or to limit the problems of GMOs, or even to encourage drought-resistant landscaping and things like that. The big agribusiness got the legislature to pass a bill to preempt cities from being able to regulate these seeds. And that bill, there was a moment in the final days of the legislature where the bill went to a conference committee and came back, and the bill had changed from not just preempting cities from regulating seeds, which would impact bees, but preventing cities from regulating anything. It was a five alarm fire kind of emergency, and cities all around the state predictably rose up in arms, and not literally, and fought back against that, and thankfully the legislature backed off from that. But there was a moment of panic where people didn't even believe me when I said it. It's like, the legislature wouldn't do that, but you just read the text of the bill and it's exactly what they did. So thankfully they struck that provision. So it went from a horrible, horrible situation to just a pretty bad situation. Wind energy, of course, is incredibly important towards fighting climate change, reducing our water needs for the power sector, and many other benefits. Texas is the national leader in wind power, and that's all great, and the predictions are that we're going to have even more wind power in the future. However, there was a bill filed in the legislature to prevent wind farms from being built within about 30 miles of a military base and then getting a state tax incentive. The argument, which is bogus, was that these wind farms were interfering with military aviation, but the fact is that every wind farm in Texas that's near a military base has reached signs an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, to make sure that there's cooperation with, and any possible concerns would be addressed. So there wasn't really a problem. However, Senator Donna Campbell, who represents parts of Austin, filed a bill to, again, prohibit wind farms from getting tax incentives if it were within 30 miles of a wind farm. And you might wonder, well, how many wind farms are even built that close? 40% have been built within 30 miles. And that's in part because, some of the best windy parts of the state are along the Gulf Coast, and there's, several military bases, Navy bases there. A lot of the West Texas wind farms there's several military bases out there. So the legislature passed that bill, the governor signed it, and so that's definitely a step backwards for wind power. So I mentioned that earlier that we successfully sued ExxonMobil for violating the Clean Air Act at its Baytown refinery and chemical plant. They are not unique in terms of violating clean air laws. We did a report last year with Environmental Integrity Project that found thousands of Texas facilities reported to the state that they had put out more than 68 million pounds of pollution illegally. So that's above and beyond the very generous permitted amount of pollution they're allowed to put out. So we know that there's kind of widespread non-compliance with environmental laws. We just did a new estimate. We found that when companies report themselves, they turn themselves into the state of Texas and say, we violated the law, we exceeded the amount of pollution. So self-reporting, the TCEQ only fines those companies about 3 or 4% of the time. So I don't know what else you would need to do to actually face punishment than self-reporting your violation. So as a result, because there's that lax enforcement by the state, a number of cities have started to take action to sue polluters when the state of Texas fails to do so, especially the city of Houston, Harris County have filed suit against big polluters. And the polluters don't like that, as you might imagine. And so last session, they passed a bill to limit how much cities and counties could collect in penalties and fees to make it a lot, it's a risky proposition to file a lawsuit against a company like Exxon, and so you need to be able to have some confidence you can recover the investment you make in legal fees, and so they capped that amount to discourage cities from filing lawsuits. That wasn't good enough, so this session they had a bill to basically say that cities and counties have to notify the state of Texas 90 days before they file suit. And if the state of Texas, let's say that the city of Houston files a lawsuit against a big polluter, finds that they violated the law 1,000 times, they notify the state of Texas, and if the state of Texas decides to take enforcement action, even one out of those 1,000, it preempts the local lawsuit entirely. And this was, it's already, when a local government files a lawsuit, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality is automatically made a party to the lawsuit, which gives them a lot of power to influence the lawsuit. So it's not like local governments were running amok and there was no control over them. And so now, the problem with that then is that you might have companies after being sued by the state, by a local community, run to the Attorney General or run to the TCEQ and try and seek a sweetheart deal where they would pay kind of a small penalty in order to avoid facing bigger consequences through the lawsuit. And that actually, we experienced that exact same thing in our lawsuit against ExxonMobil. So we sued them in 2010, And we found out later that Exxon went to TCEQ and said, will you please issue an enforcement order against us? And the chief of enforcement at the time testified in his deposition that not only did they do that, but Exxon wrote the first draft of the enforcement order that would be issued against them. So not surprisingly, it was a very weak enforcement order and it was a sweetheart deal. And then Exxon took that to the judge and said, see, these guys can't sue us anymore. The state of Texas already addressed that problem. Thankfully, ultimately, they lost on that argument, but that's the kind of thing that'll happen under this new law. Factory farms are a significant source of pollution in the state of Texas. Agriculture more broadly, according to the TCEQ, is responsible for impairing about 600 miles of Texas rivers and streams. So impairment means that it doesn't meet basic uses like swimming or fishing because of factory farms and other agriculture. And in addition to that, there are, of course, animal rights and other concerns with factory farms. The legislature passed a bill related to drones over factory farms. So some activists, some researchers are increasingly using drones to try and document environmental pollution or other violations of the law. And it's already illegal to do that, but now the legislature has authorized jail time if you do that. They've also previously private university researchers were exempted from that law. Now they're not. I think we're still kind of checking on the law. I think still public university researchers are exempt. And that's kind of our last lifeline to make sure that these guys are held accountable. Another example, in addition to pollution, is antibiotic-resistant germs being spread from some of these factory farms, because most antibiotics are used on healthy animals not to treat them, but to account for the crowded and unsanitary conditions. And so when you're using that much antibiotics, there's a risk of the antibiotic-resistant germs spreading, and Texas Tech researchers have documented that happening. So our hope is that the public universities continue to step up and research and use this technology to identify problems. There's also a program in Texas called the Low-Income Vehicle Repair and Replacement Program, or LIRAP, and it basically helps low-income people when they fail an emissions test to have funding to repair the vehicle, to make it street legal, to make sure it's not violating pollution laws, or to help them buy a new car. So either $600 for repairs or up to $3,000 to replace that polluting car with a cleaner car. And that program reduces nitrogen oxide pollution, key smog-forming pollutants, by about 70%. So it's been an important program, and the legislature reauthorized and funded the program only to have the governor veto about $80 million in funding as part of his line item veto. He only vetoed about $100 million from the budget. I think about 90 million of it was for environmental programs. So a real targeted attack on public health. And so that's, and what's to add insult to injury, and what's even more frustrating is that Texans, we here, for example, in Travis County, we pay a $2 fee to go into this program. So we've already paid for this money. It's not going to save taxpayers any money. We've already paid money into this program, and now it's just that money is going to sit there not to be spent on anything, because it's a dedicated program. So it's not like there's any even real benefit to taxpayers from this. Good news is that we have some champs for the environment who are fighting the good fight in spite of these real tough odds. We put out a scorecard every legislative session on some key votes. We show how lawmakers vote on a set of bills. And there were two Austin lawmakers who were actually the only ones in the entire state of Texas in the legislature who got 100% on the scorecard. And that was Representative Donna Howard and Senator Kirk Watson. And unfortunately, we also, in addition to the hundreds, we have some zeros. We sometimes call these guys our natural disasters of the Texas legislature. So 27 legislators this time got zeros. Last session, only 2 got zeros. And in fact, over the last 3 sessions, I've just noted a trend of percentage going down in both the House and the Senate. I hope that most of these folks don't think this is a good thing and realize, oh, I'm being called out for my zero. But Jonathan Stickland, I don't know if you can read it here, he posted on Facebook, he was proud of getting a zero. He says, apparently I earned a 0 on Environment Texas's liberal scorecard again this year. What an honor. What a jerk. But again, and there was actually a Republican primary 2 years ago, this past year, where a Republican from the College Station area, Kyle Casal, actually had the highest Republican voting scorecard on our scorecard. I think he got about 63%, and which is pretty good for, unfortunately, for Republicans. And one of his primary opponents tried to use it against him and said, look, Kyle Casal got the highest score on Environment Texas's scorecard. Thankfully, Representative Casal won re-election, or won the primary, so that did not work against him in Republican primary, which I think is important. So, Stickland's comments notwithstanding, I think, and polls certainly show that on these kinds of issues of clean air, clean water, most Texans, including Republicans, want cleaner air. They don't want dirtier air. They want cleaner water. They don't want dirtier water. They want their parks protected. So I think in most cases, these legislators aren't really representing their constituents. So now the government, the governor has called a special session, and anyone remember the church lady from Senate Live? And there's about 20 different bills that the governor, or issues the governor has asked the legislature to address in the special session, which will start on July 18th. Only one is kind of clearly environmental, and that's related to tree protection ordinances. And there's about 50 cities in Texas that have ordinances around protecting trees. And apparently the governor, before he moved into the governor's mansion, was making some renovations of his property here in Austin. And the city was asking him to try and protect some of these heritage trees. One was a pecan tree, the state tree of Texas. He ignored it, and the trees died. And so then the city's like, all right, well, it's dead, so you can remove it. But he didn't like the fact that the city was limiting him on that. And this is not an issue we've done a ton of work on. We're probably going to do some work on it this legislative session. But my understanding is that a lot of these ordinances are pretty flexible. It says that if you need to remove the tree for some reason, say it's a 10-inch tree, you could just replace it with 5 2-inch trees. And so there's some flexibility around it, but again, really helping protect the urban tree canopy, which is critical for the beauty of our cities, as well as for stormwater runoff and many other benefits. It also, of course, impacts your neighbor's property values, because having lots of trees, is a nice thing. And this is actually a photo from Dallas. The Dallas Morning News did a column showing this is why we need tree protection ordinances, because do we really want our trees just completely cut down or neutered like this? That's not a kind of a city or kind of a state we want to live in if there's no protections for trees. So I think that's the last thing I had there. So that was very depressing. So I apologize for that. But we have. I think moving forward, we know basically legislature only meets 5 months every 2 years, and we each session, for the most part, have a very modest agenda and are really working to stop some of the bad stuff. And in spite of that, could have been even worse. But we do have still opportunities, at the local level. Cities, despite the legislature's actions, still have power on a lot of things. So, for example, Austin Energy is doing a lot to promote clean energy, and I think tomorrow the Austin City Council is holding a meeting to consider setting new goals to get even up to 100% renewable energy, and joining dozens of cities around the U.S. that have set that goal, and Georgetown, which has already met it. We also know that we can keep suing big polluters, and we're going to need to do that even more so. We won our Exxon lawsuit. We've also now, together with Sierra Club, had sued, and they were also a party of our Exxon lawsuit. I still have hope. I do. In spite of everything, we can win. And then at the federal level, I think another good example. We're seeing the same kinds of assaults on our environmental protections by the Trump administration and Congress. But just a few weeks ago, the Senate voted to try and overturn President Obama's methane pollution rule on federal lands for oil and gas. And the Senate voted it down. 3 Republicans crossed over and voted to not repeal that ordinance and that rule. So it just demonstrates that we can win. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got to mobilize people, but it can definitely work. And so keep hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have about 15 minutes for question and answer, so.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Dale Beulah. Thank you very much for being here. I wanted to get an update from Environment Texas on the status of the high-level nuclear waste disposal site in West Texas and some of the impacts that could have, especially on transporting those spent fuel rods from nuclear plants all over the United States.
Sure. Thanks, Dale. That's not an issue we've done a lot of work on, but I can tell you a little bit about what I know. As folks know, there is a low-level radioactive waste dump out in West Texas in Andrews County near the New Mexico border. It's been operating for a few years now. There's an effort to change the permits to allow it to accept high-level radioactive waste, so not just like the medical waste from hospitals, but spent fuel rods from nuclear plants. And the real concern there is that by transporting all that nuclear waste through our cities, through Dallas, through San Antonio, a lot of those major highway corridors, there's a real risk of an accident, whether or even a terrorist attack. The spilling of nuclear waste could be very harmful to the public. And so I know Rick Perry, when he was governor, was a big booster in support of that nuclear waste dump. He was also received millions of dollars from the company, Waste Control Specialists, which was pushing for it. And now that he's Secretary of Energy, he's in charge of the nation's nuclear waste. So there's a real risk that that actually could move forward. There was a bill in the legislature this session. Again, I don't know the particulars of it, but would have taken additional steps to make that kind of thing possible. And thankfully, that bill failed. They ultimately, thanks to organizing by groups like Public Citizen, Sea Coalition, Sierra Club, they were able to kind of change the bill to just be a study bill and not do some proactive damage on that. So that's about all I know on that issue, but yeah, definitely something we need to be watching out for.
Hi, my name's Douglas Bauer, and I wanted you to follow up a little bit more on the Exxon lawsuit. Certainly these big companies view a certain amount of lawsuits as basically a cost of doing business. On the other hand, $20 million is probably going to catch somebody's attention, particularly at the local level, like at a plant. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more in terms of, one, how you found out about this problem, what sort of pollutions have they been putting in the air, how did you get records, that sort of thing. I'm curious how that all works.
Yeah, sure. So the pollution that we're talking about are kind of innocuously called upsets or emission events. And it's basically when something goes wrong. Equipment breaks down, an operator presses the wrong button or something, and as a result, there's a massive release of pollution. And for one of the good things that Texas does environmentally is that they have a reporting system that says if you have one of these emissions events, within 24 hours you need to notify the state of Texas, and the state of Texas uploads it onto a public website so that the public can know that this happens. And then within 2 weeks, then they have to file a final report if there were any corrections. And as I mentioned, we did a study with Environmental Integrity Project last year that found more than 68 million pounds of pollution coming from these kinds of emission events, including very dangerous and deadly pollution like particulate matter or benzene, a carcinogen, hydrogen sulfide, other serious pollutants. And a lot of these facilities are right next to communities. The Exxon facility in Baytown, 30,000 people live right around that refinery. And we know that there are serious health effects associated with this pollution. The UT School of Public Health a few years ago looked at children rates of leukemia, and they found that children living within 2 miles of the Houston Ship Channel had a 56% greater likelihood of getting leukemia as children living farther away. And the researchers pointed to the refineries as the reason. So this pollution is very harmful, and the companies are putting it out all the time, but thankfully they have to report it to the state of Texas. The state of Texas mostly doesn't do anything about it, but under the Federal Clean Air Act, citizen groups are allowed for now, because there's to sue companies that violate the law. There's actually been a bill filed in the Congress that would basically gut community groups' ability to sue. We're watching it. We don't think it's going to go forward, but that is a danger. But right now, citizen groups can sue, and so Environment Texas and Sierra Club previously sued Shell's Deer Park refinery, again next to Houston, and then Chevron Phillips chemical plant in Baytown. And both companies, when we sued them, immediately were like, okay, you busted us, let's talk. And we entered into settlement negotiations, and the companies agreed to make investments in their facilities to reduce pollution by 90%. They also paid together a $7.8 million penalty, and because they settled, we were able to use that money to go into community projects. So we got money to put solar panels on a high school in Pasadena. We were able to use money to clean up dirty diesel school buses. We also helped, we gave money to the Baylor College of Medicine to create a pediatric asthma clinic to help children along the Ship Channel. So those were all real cool developments. When we sued Exxon, they did not want to settle with us, and we had a meeting with them there where they actually said, "What do you mean that Houston's air is clean?" With a straight face, they said that, and we're like, "Whoa, what are these people we're dealing with here?" But I think you mentioned does $20 million mean much to Exxon? I think given I think their annual revenues of $40 billion or something, this is not a huge amount. What they really hate though is losing. They do not want to be told that they did something wrong, and so that's why I think they did not want to settle with us, and they spent who knows how much money, millions of dollars on their lawyers, some of the top lawyers in the country, and who are very good. I testified on the stand and got cross-examined by them, which was quite terrifying. So they spent a ton of money just on trying to fight this thing, and now that they're appealing, they'll spend millions more appealing. But yeah, I think just the fact that they lost, they've been told by a federal judge that they violated the law, that smarts. And again, I think that does send a message to other facilities. We've created a new website called neighborhoodwitness.org that I mentioned. There's a state website that collects this data. Unfortunately, it's a little bit wonky, hard to understand unless you knew exactly what you're looking for. So we've created a website that basically scrapes that data and converts it into something that regular people can understand. And so you get if you sign up for it, you get an email alert whenever these companies violate the law the very next day. And you can then, our email tells you, this company just reported they put out 10,000 pounds of hydrogen sulfide and benzene and other things. You should report this to the state, or you should file a complaint if you'd like. And so we're starting to get some of those complaints filed into TCEQ, it's still a new program, but we're optimistic that it'll help put pressure on our regulators and enforcement officials to take more action. But in addition, it will just empower the community to know about these violations, because if you live right next to a refinery, you might not know the difference between legal pollution and illegal pollution. You just think, well, that's the fact of living here or whatever. And so by telling them, no, this is different. This is against the law. These guys shouldn't do this. You should say something. We're hoping to empower people to use that information to fight back. So.
Hi, I'm Mike Powers. This question is in reference to what you said about the drones being restricted in use studying agricultural projects which are polluting and so forth, and that it's okay for public universities to use them but not private. How did the opponents make this distinction? Where does this line come from?
Yeah, good question. So basically there's already a law that identifies what's called critical infrastructure. And so these are things like power plants, refineries, wastewater treatment plants, et cetera, that they've decided for homeland security purposes need to be extra protected or whatever, and so that's why drones can't be used. And so this bill basically added feedlots to critical infrastructure, and I don't know how a terrorist would have cause problems with the feedlot or whatever, but they decided to try and add that. And so they never even made this argument. They did, they mostly just ignored the groups who were speaking out against it. So Farm and Ranch Freedom Alliance, or FARFA, was the kind of lead group fighting this, and they testified against it, but I don't think the committee even asked questions of them. So they just kind of rushed this through. They didn't even talk about that this would impact research at all. They just were like, oh, this is just about protecting privacy and fighting terrorists and these like eco-activists or whatever, and they didn't even talk about the researcher piece. So they didn't really make that argument. It's only now that we're parsing through exactly which ones are protected and which one aren't.
You've given us a little bit of hope today in the sense that there are some people who've done some things that have made a difference. And you brought up that tomorrow the Austin City Council is going to look at its generation plan and its climate protection plan for the coming next couple of years So does it make any difference if people in this room or people who are going to see your video write to their city council members and say, hey, we want 100% renewables, or we want clean air, and we want no more fossil fuels? Does that make a difference? And if so, can you tell people how to do that, so make it easy for folks to do that and tell them what the message is?
Sure.
Thank you.
And thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely communicating with your decision makers makes a difference. I think petitions get a bad rap because like, oh, well, do they even look at them? And it really is escalates. A petition to definitely pay attention to, especially if you get thousands of petitions in. For a lawmaker who is in a tight re-election race, getting thousands of petitions might mean something to them. But certainly that personal letter is even better, phone call even better, and a face-to-face interaction, the very best that you can do. But all of those things definitely add up and they help. So keep doing them for sure. Because again, I think especially for folks who are concerned about re-election, they care about those things, but really everyone does. And because even we have a petition right now targeting Senator Cruz, and people are like, really? Why even waste my time talking to Senator Cruz? But what's important is that while we might not convince him to change his vote, we might dampen his enthusiasm for attacking the environment. Because it's one thing to vote, but there's many other things that our lawmakers do besides vote. They lobby their own colleagues. They go on the cable news shows and talk about an issue. They write op-eds. They do all sorts of things. They ask tough questions at a committee hearing. And so I think hearing that public feedback, and a lawmaker also has multiple priorities, right? They have to decide what am I going to spend my time on. If they're getting a bunch of flack from their constituents about an issue, they might still vote the wrong way, but they might do a little less of all the other things. And so it helps. It can definitely have an impact. Was there another part of your question? Oh, how do you do it? Oh. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so and you could probably tell more details about it than I, but the City Council's Committee on Austin Energy, which is the entire City Council, is having a hearing, and they're considering the generation plan for Austin Energy, which is already doing some good things for clean energy. We have a goal of getting to 55% renewables by 2025, but there's an opportunity to push Austin Energy to go even further, because while we've done a lot of great things in the last few years, the bar has really been raised and the stakes have raised, especially with President Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. We need our cities to go the whole way, 100% renewables. And for example, Georgetown is already getting 100% of their energy from renewables, and it's actually cheaper than using coal and gas. So Austin absolutely can go 100%. So yeah, go to City Hall tomorrow and sign up in support and speak in support of 100% renewables. Sign up on email lists. There's also a new text service called ResistBot I've heard about, where you can send a text to your message to a legislator, but it's converted into a fax. They make it look all pretty. You just send little words and they'll turn it into a nice looking fax. So lots of different ways to communicate. Technology is helping us in this way. One other quick note on terms of talking to your elected officials, Congressman Roger Williams apparently is going to be at the Texas Capitol tomorrow at 1 o'clock. He's been one of the many to refuse to hold a town hall meeting, so might be a chance to go talk to him face to face if you're in District 25 or otherwise are concerned about some of these issues.
Yes, on the federal level, there's rather a large movement for the federal government to divest itself of huge swaths of publicly protected land, and either to get rid of it or transfer it to the states, where it'd be open to greater mining and timber and drilling interests. Do you see such a threat to the federal public land in the state of Texas?
Well, yeah, so we're already, great question, we're already starting to see initially rollbacks of some of the national monuments that President Obama created. So for example, the Bears Ears National Monument in Utah, Secretary of the Interior, Zinke, I think that's how you pronounce his name, just recently toured it, and he's proposed keeping the monument, but just kind of scaling back how large it is. So that's one example of and that means then that area that's no longer part of the monument would be open to mining or drilling, et cetera. So we're already starting to see those attacks. There actually was a bill filed in Congress by Congressman Jason Chaffetz to privatize a lot of these public lands. And here's another story of hope. He heard from tons of his constituents, including people from the hunting and fishing community, in opposition to that plan, and he backed off. You asked specifically about Texas, and the one threat, I don't know about the auctioning off. I haven't heard of any specific sale proposals for that. However, one thing that did just happen is the Bureau of Land Management just sold drilling rights under several Texas lakes, including Lake Somerville out in Brenham, where Bluebell ice cream is. So fracking will now be allowed under Brenham's public drinking water supply. So.
All right, we've run out of time. Thank you very much for your presentation today.
Thank you.